Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, inside a cold stone room, with no windows, no sound, and then you hear it, footsteps. Slow, heavy, getting closer along a narrow corridor. You hold your breath, because deep down, you already know, whoever is coming is not here to save you. How much is a crown worth? For two young princes, it cost them their lives. Before we step deeper into one of the darkest betrayals in medieval history, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Let me know down below. They weren't supposed to be here. They were just children. One was around 12. The other, even younger, princes of England, born into silk, ceremony, and exploitation. They should have been running through palace gardens, laughing, arguing over childish things, living a life carefully protected by the crown they were meant to inherit. But history has a cruel way of rewriting childhood. Instead of gardens, they were taken to a fortress, the Tower of London, not as guests, but as prisoners, and no one could truly explain why. At first, they were still seen, walking along the inner courtyards. Looking out from the windows, people whispered, "They're still there." But slowly, something changed. The sightings became fewer. The windows stayed empty. The laughter disappeared. Until one day, there was nothing, no announcements, no funerals, no bodies, just silence, a silence so complete, it felt as though the tower itself had swallowed them whole. And in many ways, there was far more terrifying than death. Of course, people began to ask questions, because princes don't just vanish, and all eyes slowly turned toward one man, their uncle, Richard III, the man who stood to gain everything if the boys were no longer in the way. But here's where the story becomes unsettling. There was no confession, no undeniable proof, only whispers, suspicions, and a crown that suddenly changed hands. So let me ask you, if you were a ruler and your throne depended on two children disappearing, what would you do? Would you trust fate or make sure of it?
Centuries have passed. Empires have risen and fallen, and yet this mystery refuses to fade. Historians still argue. Theories still clash. Some believe the princes were murdered. Others think they may have escaped. And then there are those who believe we were never meant to know the truth at all, because sometimes it's not the answers that survive history. It's the questions. Maybe some secrets are buried so deep that time itself chooses to protect them. And maybe that's exactly why this story still lingers in the dark corners of history. Two boys, a tower, and a silence that has lasted for centuries. If you enjoy quiet, haunting stories like this, subscribe and stay with me. There are many more forgotten nights in history, waiting to be uncovered. You know what's strange? History usually remembers kings, wars, and victories. But sometimes the stories that refuse to die are the quiet ones. The ones where no one screams, no one confesses, and no one is ever found again. So let me take you somewhere for a moment. Not to a battlefield, not to a grand throne room, but to a cold, silent chamber inside the Tower of London. Picture this, two boys, not soldiers, not criminals, just kids. One barely a teenager, the other even younger. And on this particular night, something changes, because this is the night the tower stops feeling like a place and starts feeling like a trap. Now here's the part people don't usually tell you. The Tower of London wasn't always a prison. It was a royal residence. Kings stayed there, Nobles visited. It had comfort, structure, even a sense of safety. So when the two princes were brought there, it didn't immediately feel like a death sentence. At least, not at first. But slowly, things began to shift. Doors that were once open started closing. Guards that were once polite became distant. And the outside world, it just faded away. No more public appearances. No more glimpses from the window. Just stone walls. And time stretching in a way that feels wrong. And here's a shocking fact most people don't realize. The younger prince, Richard, was only around 9 years old. 9.
At that age, you're supposed to be playing, learning, asking silly questions, not sitting in a fortress, wondering why no one is coming to take you home. Now imagine being the older brother. You don't fully understand politics, but you understand enough to know something is off. You start noticing patterns, the whispers, the way servants avoid eye contact, the way even the guards don't stay too long near your door. And then comes the worst part, the waiting, because nothing happens right away. No dramatic moment, no sudden violence, just days turning into nights, and nights that feel heavier than the last. And at some point, you start realizing something terrifying. No one is coming, not your allies, not your family, not the people who swore loyalty to your father. It's like the entire world just decided to forget you exist. And that brings us to another shocking detail. The princes were last seen playing in the tower grounds, and then they were simply never seen again. No official announcement, no explanation. They didn't die in the public eye, they just stopped existing. And honestly, that might be even more disturbing, because when someone dies, at least there's closure. But when someone disappears like this, your mind fills in the blanks, and those imagined endings, they're often worse than the truth. Now here's where things get even more unsettling. People at the time knew something was wrong. This wasn't a secret that happened in complete darkness. Rumors spread, quietly, carefully, but they spread. People whispered, "Why haven't we seen the princes? Why hasn't anyone heard from them? Why is everything suddenly so quiet?" And yet, no one did anything. No uprising, no rescue attempt, just silence. And if you think about it, that might be the scariest part of all, because it means one thing: whoever was behind this was powerful enough to make an entire kingdom look the other way. Let that sink in for a second. To royal children with a rightful claim to the throne vanish, and the world just continues. Normal life goes on, which raises a question I want you to really think about. How powerful does someone have to be to erase people like they were never there? And we're just getting started, because in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the one man who had the most to gain from their silence. You ever notice how the scariest moments in life aren't always loud? Not chaos, not screaming, but the quiet moments where something just feels wrong. That's exactly what this part of the story feels like, because for the two princes, nothing dramatic happened overnight. No sudden attack, no visible threat, just a slow, creeping realization that their world was shrinking. Day by day, the routines changed. Fewer visitors, shorter conversations. Even the servants, the same people who once smiled at them, now moved quickly, spoke less, avoided questions. And when you're a child, you might not understand politics, but you understand when people start acting differently around you. That instinct, it's powerful. It tells you something before your mind can explain it. And imagine this. You're inside a massive stone tower, surrounded by walls so thick no sound escapes easily, and somehow the silence starts to feel louder than any noise ever could. Now here's something most people don't think about, and honestly, it changes how you see this entire story. The Tower of London wasn't just physically isolating, it was psychologically suffocating. Think about it. No real connection to the outside world. No letters freely coming in and out. No trusted allies walking through the door. The princes weren't just trapped, they were cut off completely. And here's a shocking fact that hits harder the more you think about it. There are no verified records of the princes communicating with anyone outside the tower in their final days. None. Which means whatever fear, confusion, or realization they were going through, they went through it alone. No one to reassure them. No one to explain what was happening. Just two brothers trying to make sense of a situation that didn't make sense at all. And if you've ever felt isolated even for a short time, you know how fast your thoughts can spiral. Now imagine that, but with your life quietly hanging in the balance. And then there's the older brother. This part always gets me, because you can almost picture it without anyone writing it down. The older Prince Edward, he wasn't a baby. He was old enough to observe, to question, to connect the dots. He had been raised to be king. After all, that means he was taught about loyalty, betrayal, power. So while the younger one might have still been confused, the older one, he might have started to understand. Slowly, painfully. And that realization, that shift from something feels off to something is very wrong, that's terrifying. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And here's another shocking detail. Edward V was never officially crowned king, even though he technically inherited the throne. Let that sink in. A boy who was supposed to be king, sitting in a tower, waiting, while somewhere outside, decisions were being made about his future without him even knowing. That's not just political maneuvering, that's quiet removal. Now think about the nights, because daytime at least gives you distraction. Light coming through cracks, footsteps in the distance, some sense that life still exists. But night is different. Night amplifies everything. Every sound feels closer. Every shadow feels alive. And this is where that image we talked about earlier becomes real again. Lying awake, hearing footsteps in the corridor, not once, not twice, but regularly. Guards changing shifts, unknown figures passing by, doors opening somewhere far away, then closing again. And you start wondering which footsteps matter, which ones don't, because eventually your mind starts playing a dangerous game. What if the next set of footsteps stops at your door? And here's something chilling historians often point out. There are accounts suggesting the princes were seen less and less until they were no longer seen at all, almost as if they were being gradually hidden from view on purpose. Not suddenly gone, but slowly erased. And honestly, that's what makes this story feel so calculated, so controlled. Like someone didn't just want them gone, they wanted the world to adjust to their absence. And this is where everything shifts from unsettling to deeply disturbing, because by now, it's not just about two boys in a tower. It's about intention. Someone made a decision, not in anger, not in chaos, but carefully, quietly, step by step. Isolation, silence, disappearance, and the world outside still moving. Markets open, people talking, life continuing as if nothing is wrong. Which brings us to a question I want you to really sit with for a second, because this is where the story stops being history and starts feeling uncomfortably real. If you remove someone slowly enough, quietly enough, do people eventually stop asking questions? And maybe that's the most dangerous kind of power there is. Not the power to destroy loudly, but the power to make something disappear without resistance. And in the next part, we're going to step outside the tower for the first time and look at the man whose shadow was quietly growing larger while the princes were fading away. Let's step outside the tower for a moment, because while those two boys were slowly being swallowed by silence, there was someone else whose world was moving in the exact opposite direction. rising, expanding, getting closer to the crown. And this is where the story starts to feel less like a mystery and more like a chess game, because in medieval England, power didn't just fall into your hands. You had to position yourself for it carefully, patiently, and right at the center of this moment in history was one man, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the prince's own uncle. Now on the surface, that might not sound alarming. Families ruled kingdoms all the time. Uncles protected nephews. Regents governed until young kings came of age. It was normal. That's exactly what makes this so unsettling, because nothing at the beginning looked obviously wrong. In fact, Richard was trusted, respected, seen as loyal to the family. But here's the thing about power. It rarely shows its full face at the start. When the prince's father, King Edward IV, died, everything changed overnight. The crown technically passed to his eldest son, the young Edward. But here's the problem. He was still a child, and a child king means one thing: someone else has to rule in his place, at least temporarily. That someone became Richard. He was named Lord Protector. Sounds harmless, right? Even responsible. But this is where things begin to tighten, because being protector didn't just give him authority, gave him control over the court, over decisions, over access to the young king himself. And here's a shocking fact that flips the entire situation on its head. Within weeks of becoming protector, Richard had key allies of the young king arrested and executed. Not quietly removed, executed. These weren't random figures, they were powerful men who supported the princes. So ask yourself, is that protection, or is that elimination? Now imagine how fast everything must have felt from the outside. One moment, the kingdom is adjusting to a new young king, and the next, the people closest to him are gone. Suddenly, Richard isn't just helping, he's consolidating power. And here's where it gets even more disturbing, because what happens next isn't about force, it's about narrative. Richard begins to question whether the princes are even legitimate heirs to the throne. Let that sink in. Not by proving it with clear evidence, but by spreading doubt. And in a time where information was controlled and literacy was limited, doubt was powerful. If people start believing the princes were never meant to rule, then removing them doesn't feel like betrayal anymore. It starts to feel like correction. And here's another shocking detail. Richard had the princes officially declared illegitimate through an act known as titulus regius. Just like that, 2 royal children went from rightful heirs to obstacles. And once you see that move, everything starts to look different, because this wasn't chaos. This wasn't a sudden grab for power. This was structured, step by step. First, take control as protector, then remove key supporters, then rewrite the narrative. And after that, what's left? 2 boys, isolated, powerless, and increasingly invisible. And here's something that really makes people uncomfortable when they first hear it. Richard was crowned King Richard III while the princes were still alive inside the tower. Think about that timing. Not after their disappearance, not after any official resolution, while they were still there, still existing, somewhere behind stone walls. And the kingdom, it accepted it. Maybe not everyone believed it, maybe not everyone agreed, but there was no uprising strong enough to stop it. And that tells you just how effective control over perception can be. So now we're standing at a very uncomfortable crossroads in the story. On one side, you have 2 children locked away, slowly fading from public view. On the other side, you have a man rising to the highest position in the kingdom, removing obstacles one by one, and no direct proof connecting the two. That's what makes this so powerful even today, because it forces you to sit with uncertainty, to ask questions that don't have clean answers. Was Richard protecting the realm from instability? Or was he quietly clearing his path to the throne? And here's the question I want you to really think about before we continue. If someone gains everything at the exact moment others lose everything, is that coincidence? Or is that design? Because in the next part, we're going to go deeper into what people at the time actually believed, and why even back then, this didn't feel right. So here's where the story gets really uncomfortable, because up until now, you could still argue that everything was just politics. Harsh, maybe even ruthless, but still within the rules of that time. Kings died, power shifted, alliances broke. That wasn't unusual. But what was unusual was how people started to feel about it. Not officially, not in public declarations, but in quiet conversations, in glances, in hesitation. Because even back then, without modern media, without investigations, without evidence laid out neatly, people could sense when something wasn't right. And that's exactly what started happening after Richard took the crown. It didn't feel like a clean transition. It felt off, like something important had been skipped over, like two pieces on the board had been removed too quietly. Now think about this for a second. Imagine living in a time where you suspect something terrible has happened, but you have no safe way to say it out loud. No social media, no press, no protection, just rumors. And rumors were dangerous, because if you accused the wrong person or even implied something, you weren't just risking being wrong, you were risking your life. And yet, despite that fear, the whispers spread anyway. That tells you something. It means the unease was strong enough that people couldn't ignore it. And here's a shocking fact that historians often highlight. Within just a short time of Richard becoming king, rumors began circulating across England that the princes had been murdered. Not years later, not after evidence surfaced, almost immediately. That kind of reaction doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from patterns people are noticing in real time. But here's where it gets even more interesting and, honestly, more disturbing. The rumors didn't just say the princes were gone. They started forming stories, different versions, different possibilities. Some said they were smothered in their sleep. Others believed they were quietly taken away and killed elsewhere. And here's the thing, none of these stories were confirmed, but they kept evolving, growing, spreading from one town to another. And when a story spreads that fast without proof, it usually means one thing. People are trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense on its own. And here's another shocking detail. There was never an official statement from Richard III explaining what happened to the princes. Nothing clear, nothing direct, just silence. And silence, especially from someone in power, can sometimes speak louder than any explanation. Now let's pause on that for a moment, because this is where things get psychologically fascinating. When people in authority don't address something this big, it creates a vacuum. And what fills that vacuum? Imagination, fear, suspicion. And suddenly, every small detail starts to feel meaningful. The fact that no one sees the princes anymore, the fact that Richard doesn't mention them publicly, the fact that no one can confirm where they are, all of it starts stacking up. And here's something that really adds weight to the suspicion. Later accounts suggest that even foreign observers, people outside England, were already convinced the princes were dead. Think about that. News wasn't fast back then. Information travelled slowly. And yet, even beyond the kingdom, the narrative had already taken shape. The boys were gone, and it wasn't natural. That kind of widespread belief doesn't happen unless something feels deeply wrong. And this is where I want you to really put yourself in that time period, just for a moment. You're not a noble. You're not part of the court. You're just an ordinary person hearing bits and pieces. You don't know the truth, but you can feel that something has shifted. The rightful king is no longer seen. His younger brother is gone too. A new king sits on the throne, and no one is explaining anything. So what do? Do you accept it and move on? Or do you quietly hold on to that doubt, that feeling that something unjust has happened? Because here's the uncomfortable reality. Most people chose silence, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't afford not to. And that silence, it allowed the mystery to survive, to grow, to become something bigger than just an event. It became a question that no one could answer, and that, even centuries later, we're still trying to understand. Alright. This is the part where the story stops feeling like politics and starts feeling like something much darker, because up until now, everything we've talked about, power, control, rumors, it all builds toward one question that no one has ever been able to answer clearly. What actually happened inside that tower? Not the theories, not the whispers, but the exact moment everything ended. And here's the uncomfortable truth. There is no confirmed record of that night. No witness stepping forward. No official account. It's like history just goes quiet at the most important moment. And when that happens, when a moment that should be recorded simply isn't, it usually means one of two things. Either no one saw it, or no one who saw it was ever allowed to speak. Now imagine the tower again, but this time, not as a place of waiting, but as a place where something final is about to happen. Night falls, the corridors grow empty, torches burn lower, guards rotate shifts like any other night. Everything appears normal on the surface. And that's what makes it so chilling. Because if something did happen, it didn't happen in chaos. It didn't happen with noise or resistance echoing through the halls. It would have been controlled, quiet, deliberate. And here's a shocking fact that historians often debate. There are no contemporary reports of a struggle, no alarm raised, no record of disturbance inside the tower at the time the princes are believed to have disappeared. Nothing, which suggests that whatever happened in a way that left no trace behind. And that's not something you get from accident. That's something you get from planning. Let's talk about one of the most widely circulated possibilities, not as fact, but as something people at the time believed. The idea that the princes were killed in their sleep, smothered, silent, no blood, no noise, no visible aftermath, just gone by morning. And I want you to pause here for a second, because this is where the story becomes deeply human again. These weren't enemies on a battlefield. These were children in a room they thought, at least at some point, was safe. And if this version is true, it means their final moments weren't filled with understanding or closure, but confusion, maybe even trust. And here's another shocking detail. One of the earliest detailed accounts of their possible murder didn't appear until decades later, written under a completely different king, which raises a huge question. Was that account truth finally being revealed, or was it a story shaped by politics after the fact? And that's where things start to blur in a way that makes this mystery so difficult to pin down, because every version of what happened comes with its own problem. Some were written too late. Some were written under rulers who had reasons to make Richard look worse. Others are based on second-hand account stories passed from one person to another, changing slightly each time. So now you're stuck in this strange place where you have multiple answers, but none of them feel completely solid. And here's something that really complicates everything. No bodies were officially presented at the time to confirm the princes' deaths. Think about how unusual that is. Even in medieval times, death, especially royal death, was usually marked, recorded, acknowledged. But here, nothing, just absence. And absence is incredibly hard to prove. So now we're left standing in the dark, just like the people back then, trying to piece together something that may have been intentionally hidden. And this is where I want you to really think Not just about what happened, but about why it was done this way. Because if the goal was simply to remove the princes, there were easier, more visible ways to do it. Exile, public execution under some charge, but that's not what happened. Instead, we get silence, disappearance, a missing moment in history that no one can fully reconstruct, which leads to a question that historians still wrestle with today. Was the real goal not just to remove the princes, but to remove the story of them entirely? Because in the next part, we're going to look at something even more unsettling, the discovery, years later, that might, or might not, have finally revealed what happened inside those walls. So, for years, the story just sits there, unfinished. Two princes go into the tower, and then nothing. No confirmation, no closure, just this quiet, uncomfortable gap in history. And people learn to live with that gap. They pass the story down, they argue about it, they form opinions, but there's still no physical proof until something happens. And this is the part where even historians pause for a second, because it feels almost too perfect, too late, too convenient. Decades after the princes disappeared during renovations inside the Tower of London, workers reportedly uncover something buried beneath a staircase. Not treasure, not artifacts. Bones, small bones, and suddenly, a mystery that lived in whispers collides with something real. Something you can point to and say, wait, what if this is them? Now imagine being there at that moment. You're not thinking about centuries of debate. You're just staring at what looks like the remains of children, hidden in a place where children were never supposed to be hidden. And immediately, the story rushes back. The missing princes, the silence, the unanswered questions. It all connects in an instant. And here's a shocking fact that makes this even more intense. The bones were discovered in 1674, 200 years after the princes vanished. 200 years. That's not a short delay. That's generations of people living and dying without knowing the truth. Only for this discovery to suddenly reopen everything. And you'd think, okay, this is it. Mystery solved. But it's not that simple. Not even close. Because here's where things start to get frustrating in a very real way. The bones were assumed to belong to the princes. Not proven. Not confirmed with certainty. Just accepted based on location and circumstance. They were later placed in Westminster Abbey, treated as if they were royal remains, and for many people, that was enough. Case closed. But if you look closer, you start seeing cracks in that conclusion. And here's another shocking detail. Modern scientific testing on the bones has been extremely limited, and requests for more advanced DNA analysis have been denied or restricted multiple times. Think about that. In a world where we can identify remains from centuries ago with high accuracy, one of the most famous missing person cases in history still doesn't have definitive testing, which leaves us in this strange position where we might have the answer, but we're not allowed to fully confirm it. And that uncertainty keeps the story alive in a way that a clear answer never could. Because if those bones are the princes, then we're looking at a quiet, hidden burial, something done in secrecy, without ceremony, without acknowledgement. That alone says a lot. But if those bones are not the princes, then the mystery becomes even deeper. It means the real truth is still out there somewhere, completely untouched. And here's something that adds another layer to all of this. Some historians have argued that the bones could belong to other children who lived or worked in the tower over the centuries, meaning the entire identification might be based on assumption rather than evidence. So now we're not just dealing with a missing story, we're dealing with a possible misdirection that has lasted for hundreds of years. And this is where I want you to really sit with the weight of this mystery. because most historical stories eventually settle into something solid: facts, dates, conclusions. But this one refuses to do that. Every time it feels like we're close to an answer, something pulls us back into uncertainty. And maybe that's why it still captures people's attention today, because it's not just about what happened to two princes, it's about how easily truth can be lost, buried, or reshaped over time. So here's the question I want to leave you with before we move forward. If the only physical evidence we have might not even be reliable, then what are we really basing our beliefs on? And in the next chapter, we're going to explore something even more intriguingly: alternative theories that suggest maybe the princes didn't die in the tower at all. Okay, let's go somewhere a little uncomfortable, but also kind of fascinating, because up to this point, most of the story has been leaning toward one dark conclusion: that the princes were killed inside the tower, quietly, secretly. End of story. But here's the thing: history doesn't actually confirm that, not definitively. And when something that big isn't confirmed, it leaves space for another possibility, a smaller voice in the background that keeps asking, what if they didn't die at all? I know it sounds unlikely at first, almost like wishful thinking, but if you really look at the gaps in the story, the lack of proof, the silence, the missing records, that question starts to feel less crazy and more like something worth exploring. Now imagine this scenario for a second. Instead of being killed, the princes are quietly removed from the tower, not through violence but through secrecy, taken out under cover of night, hidden, possibly sent somewhere far away where no one would recognize them. It sounds like something out of a novel, but in medieval politics, exile was actually a common solution, especially when killing someone outright could create backlash. And here's a shocking fact that makes this theory stick around. There were multiple individuals, years later, who claimed to be one of the lost princes, and some of them actually gained real support, not just from random people, but from nobles and even foreign powers. Think about that. These weren't dismissed immediately. Some people believed them strongly enough to risk their own positions. One of the most famous cases is a man named Perkin Warbeck. Now, on the surface, he might sound like just another imposter, someone trying to take advantage of a mystery. But his story is where things start to get really interesting. He didn't just claim to be one of the princes. He claimed to be Richard, the younger one, and somehow his story was convincing enough that powerful figures across Europe supported him. Kings, rulers, people who had access to information we don't have today. And here's where it gets even more surprising. Warbeck was recognized as the rightful prince by several foreign courts, including the King of Scotland. That's not a small endorsement. That's international recognition. So you have to ask yourself, were all these people fooled? Or did they know something that history later buried? But, of course, there's another side to this, because for every person who believed Warbeck, there were others who saw him as exactly what you'd expect: an opportunist, someone using a famous mystery to gain power. And eventually, his story collapsed. He was captured, interrogated, and ultimately executed. And just like that, one possible answer disappeared again. But here's the detail that keeps this theory alive. Even under interrogation, the truth about Warbeck's identity was never fully settled in a way that convinced everyone. Some believed he confessed, others believed the confession was forced. And when you combine that with the fact that records from that time are often biased or incomplete, you're left with yet another version of the story that can't be fully trusted or fully dismissed. So now we're standing in a very strange place in this mystery. On one side, you have the theory that the princes died in the tower, supported by logic, timing, and suspicion. On the other side, you have this alternative path, where maybe, just maybe, at least one of them survived, escaped, lived under a different identity, and tried to reclaim what was taken, and neither side has enough evidence to completely win, which is exactly why this story refuses to fade, because it forces you to choose what feels more believable. And here's the question I want you to really think about. Is it harder to believe that two princes were secretly killed, or that one of them survived and spent years trying to prove who he really was? Because in the next part, we're going to dig deeper into these survivor theories and why some historians still take them seriously today. Alright, so now we're stepping into territory that feels almost unbelievable, but it actually happened, because once the idea spread that maybe the princes didn't die, something interesting followed. People started showing up, not just one or two random claims, but multiple individuals at different times, in different places, all saying some version of the same thing. I am one of the lost princes. And I want you to think about how bold that is. You're not claiming to be a forgotten noble or a distant relative. You're claiming to be a missing royal child whose disappearance shook an entire kingdom. That's not just risky, that's almost suicidal if it's false, which immediately raises a question. Why would anyone take that risk? Unless there was at least a chance people might believe them. Now let's go back to Perkin Warbeck for a second, because his story doesn't just end with he claimed something and got executed. It's way more layered than that. Warbeck didn't pop up out of nowhere with a wild story. He appeared gradually, was coached, supported, and presented in a way that made him seem legitimate. He learned court behavior, royal etiquette, even details about the life he was claiming to have lived. And here's a shocking fact that makes people pause every time. Warbeck was accepted by Margaret of Burgundy, the sister of King Edward IV, the prince's own aunt, who publicly supported his claim that he was Richard, Duke of York. Think about that. This isn't a random noble. This is family. Someone who would have known the princes personally. So now you're stuck with a dilemma. Either she was completely fooled, or she believed him, and both options are unsettling for very different reasons. But Warbeck wasn't the only one. There was another figure, Lambert Simnel, who appeared even earlier, claiming to be another royal heir. Now, his case is a bit different, more clearly manipulated by powerful figures behind the scenes, but it still shows a pattern. A kingdom where the truth is unclear becomes a breeding ground for alternative versions of reality. And here's another shocking detail. Simnel was actually crowned as king in Ireland by his supporters before being defeated, crowned, even if briefly, even if ultimately unsuccessful. That's how far people were willing to go based on uncertainty. So when you put Simnel and Warbeck side by side, you start seeing something bigger than just individual you start seeing a system that allowed these claims to gain traction, because the original truth was never firmly established. And this brings us to something deeper, something psychological. When people don't have a clear answer, they don't just wait patiently, they fill the gap. They create narratives that feel right, that restore some kind of order. And in this case, the idea that at least one prince survived was comforting. It meant the story wasn't just about loss and betrayal. It meant there was still hope, still a chance that justice could be restored. And here's something that adds weight to that idea. Some supporters of Warbeck followed him for years, even after setbacks, even when it became dangerous to do so. That kind of loyalty doesn't come from a weak belief. It comes from conviction, or from desperation for something to believe in. And sometimes, those two things look almost identical. So where does that leave us? On one hand, you can say these pretenders were exactly that, pretenders, opportunists stepping into a gap left by history. But on the other hand, You can't completely ignore how far their claims went, how many people they convinced, and how long the idea of a surviving prince managed to stay alive. And that's what makes this part of the story so hard to dismiss, because even if every single claimant was false, they exist because the truth was never clear, and that uncertainty is powerful. It reshapes reality, creates new possibilities, and keeps questions alive long after they should have faded. So here's the question I want you to think about as we move forward. If the truth had been clear from the beginning, would any of these lost princes have ever existed at all? Or were they created by the silence left behind? Let's do something a little different now. Instead of asking what happened in the tower, I want you to think about what happened after. Not immediately after, but years later, when new rulers came in, new stories were told, and suddenly the past started to look very different. Because here's something people don't always realize. History isn't just recorded, it's shaped, especially when power changes hands. And in this case, the man who eventually took the throne after Richard III, Henry VII, had every reason to control the narrative, not just to rule the country, but to justify how he came to rule it. And that's where this mystery takes another turn, because once Henry becomes king, the story of the princes doesn't disappear. It gets rewritten in a way that points very clearly in one direction. Now think about Henry VII's position for a second. He defeats Richard III in battle, takes the crown, and starts a new dynasty. But here's the problem: his claim to the throne isn't exactly strong by bloodline. It's complicated, distant, and not as clean as the prince's claim would have been if they were alive. So what does that mean? It means the princes, even in their absence, are still a threat, not physically, but symbolically, because as long as people believe they might have been the rightful rulers, Henry's position feels less secure. And here's a shocking fact that makes this really interesting. Much of what we know about the alleged murder of the princes comes from sources written during or after Henry VII's reign, not at the time it supposedly happened, but later, under a new king who benefited from Richard looking guilty. That doesn't automatically make it false, but it definitely makes it complicated. And this is where one of the most famous names connected to this story enters the picture: Thomas More. You might have heard of him before, maybe in a completely different context. He wrote a detailed account describing how the princes were supposedly murdered in the tower. It's one of the most vivid versions of the story we have. The suffocation, the secrecy, the burial. It reads almost like a scene from a novel. But here's the part that makes historians pause. Thomas More was a child at the time the princes disappeared, and his account was written decades later. So where did his information come from? That's the question. Was it based on reliable sources, or on stories that had already been shaped by the political environment he lived in? Because by the time More was writing, Richard III's reputation had already taken a serious hit. And it doesn't stop there. The story gets even more solidified later on through literature, most famously through William Shakespeare. His play Richard III portrays Richard as a deeply villainous figure, almost designed to be hated, manipulative, ruthless, physically deformed. It's a powerful portrayal, and for many people, that version of Richard becomes the version they remember. But here's another shocking detail. Shakespeare was writing during the reign of the Tudor dynasty, the same line started by Henry VII. So again, we have to ask, how much of this portrayal is history, and how much is storytelling shaped by the people in power? Because when a narrative is repeated enough through books, plays, education, it starts to feel like undeniable truth, even if its origins are more complex. So now we're looking at the story from a completely different angle. Not just what happened, but who told the story afterward. And that matters more than you might think. Because if the version of events we've inherited comes largely from people who benefited from a certain outcome, then we have to be careful about accepting it without question. It doesn't mean Richard was innocent. It doesn't mean the princes survived. But it does mean that the official story might not be as neutral as it seems. And here's the question I want you to really think about. If history is written by those who win, then how much of this mystery is truth? And how much of it is a story that was convenient to believe? Because in the next part, we're going to look at how modern historians are re-examining all of this, and why the answer might not be as settled as people once thought. So now we've reached a point where the story isn't just about kings and princes anymore. It's about evidence, real, tangible, testable evidence, or the frustrating lack of it. Because for centuries, people mostly accepted the version of events that painted Richard III as the villain. It was clean, it made sense, and it fit the narrative passed down through powerful voices like Thomas More and Shakespeare. But here's the thing about history. It doesn't stay frozen. New generations come in, ask new questions, and sometimes they start poking at things people once thought were settled. And that's exactly what modern historians have been doing with this case. Not trying to rewrite history for the sake of it, but trying to separate what's proven from what's simply been repeated enough times to feel true. Now imagine approaching this mystery like a detective today. You wouldn't just accept old stories, you'd ask, where's the evidence? Who wrote this? When did they write it? What did they gain from it? And when historians started doing exactly that, cracks began to show. Because a lot of the evidence against Richard isn't direct, it's layered through accounts written years later, often under rulers who had a reason to make Richard look guilty. And here's a shocking fact that really shifts perspective. There is no surviving official order, document, or confession linking Richard III directly to the murder of the princes. None. For something that would have been one of the most significant acts of that era, there's no clear paper trail. Now, of course, you could argue that it was done in secret, but still that absence of evidence leaves room for doubt, and historians don't ignore that. And this is where things get even more interesting, because modern researchers haven't just questioned the written sources they've started re-examining physical evidence too. Remember those bones found in the tower? For years, they were treated as the likely remains of the princes, but with today's technology, you'd expect a definitive answer by now, right? DNA testing, forensic analysis, all of it. But here's the frustrating part. Access to those remains has been extremely limited, and full modern DNA testing has not been widely permitted. That means we're sitting on potential evidence that could answer a centuries-old mystery, and we still don't have a clear result. And that alone keeps the door open, because until something is definitively proven, alternative theories don't go away, they survive. And speaking of alternative theories, modern historians have started exploring possibilities that were once dismissed. Could someone else have ordered the princes' deaths? Could it have happened after Richard's reign? Could political rivals, future rulers, or even internal factions have played a role? These questions aren't just random speculation. They come from analyzing timelines, motives, and inconsistencies in the historical record. And here's another shocking detail. Some historians have suggested that Henry VII himself had a stronger motive to ensure the princes were gone permanently, since their existence even rumoured posed a threat to his rule. Now, that doesn't prove he was responsible, but it does complicate the idea that Richard was the only possible suspect. And once you start seeing multiple plausible motives, the certainty people once had begins to fade. So where does that leave us? Honestly, in a place that feels both frustrating and fascinating, because after all this time, with all our modern tools and knowledge, we still can't say with absolute certainty what happened. And maybe that's the most surprising part of all. Not that something mysterious happened, but that it has remained unresolved for so long. And this is what I want you to really think about. In a world where we're used to having answers instantly, how do we deal with a mystery that refuses to be solved? Because the story of the princes isn't just about the past anymore, it's about how we understand truth itself. And in the next chapter, we're going to step back and look at the bigger picture, why this story still captures people's attention, and what it reveals about power, fear, and human nature. You ever wonder why some stories just won't go away? Like, out of all the wars, all the kings, all the massive events in history, why this one? 2 boys, no confirmed ending, no clear culprit, and yet people are still talking about it hundreds of years later. It's kind of strange when you think about it, but the more you sit with it, the more it starts to make sense. Because this isn't just a history story, it taps into something deeper, something human: fear, injustice, unanswered questions. Those things don't age, and the story of the princes has all of it. It's not just about what happened, it's about what might have happened, and sometimes that's even more powerful. Now think about how most stories work. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. You know who did what, why they did it, and how it all concludes. That structure gives you closure. It lets your mind relax. But this story, it breaks that pattern completely. There's a beginning too. Princes entering the tower. There's a middle, political tension, rising suspicion. But the ending, it's missing. And that missing piece creates a kind of mental tension that never fully resolves. And here's a shocking fact that explains why this matters. Studies in psychology show that people remember incomplete stories more vividly than complete ones, because the brain keeps trying to finish them. So in a way, this mystery is designed to stay alive in people's minds, not intentionally, but effectively. And then there's the emotional side of it, which honestly might be the biggest reason this story sticks. Because at its core, this isn't about powerful adults making strategic moves. It's about children caught in the middle of something they didn't create that changes everything. If this were just another political execution, it might not hit as hard. But to young boys, isolated, possibly betrayed by their own family, that creates a different kind of reaction. It makes people uncomfortable in a way that doesn't fade easily. And here's another shocking detail. Throughout history, stories involving innocent victims, children tend to be retold more often and remembered longer than stories about adult conflict. It's not just history, it's human nature. We hold on to those stories because they feel unresolved on a moral level, not just a factual one. But there's something else, too, something more subtle, but just as important. This story challenges our trust in authority. Think about it. A royal family, a powerful government, decisions being made behind closed doors, information being controlled, people staying silent out of fear. It doesn't feel ancient, it feels familiar. And maybe that's part of why it keeps resurfacing. Because even though the setting is medieval, the themes are timeless. Power protecting itself, truth being uncertain. And here's something that really connects it to today. Historians often point out that this case is one of the earliest examples where public perception and political narrative played a major role in shaping truth. Not just facts, but what people believed happened. And that's something we still deal with right now, just in different forms. So when you step back and look at it, the mystery of the princes isn't just about solving a case. It's about understanding why some questions matter more than others, why some stories fade and others stay with us. Because this one doesn't just sit in the past, it keeps asking something of the present. It asks how we deal with uncertainty, how we decide what to believe, and whether we're okay with not having all the answers. And that leads to a question I want you to really think about before we continue. Is this story unforgettable because of what happened, or because we may never truly know what happened? Because in the next part, we're going to bring everything together and look at what this mystery ultimately tells us about power, truth, and the stories we choose to believe. Let's be honest for a second. This story isn't really just about the princes anymore, is it? I mean, yeah, that's how it starts. 2 boys, a tower, a disappearance. But the deeper you go, the more it starts to feel like something else entirely. Like a case study of how power actually works behind the scenes. Because when you strip away the titles, the castles, the old language, what you're left with is something very familiar. People protecting their position, controlling information, and shaping reality in ways that benefit them. And that's uncomfortable, because it means this isn't just a long time ago problem. It's something that can happen in any era, including ours. Now think about how truth is supposed to work. Ideally, something happens. It gets recorded. Evidence supports it. And over time, it becomes accepted as fact. Simple, right? But this story completely breaks that model, because here, the truth depends heavily on who's telling it and when they're telling it. One version paints Richard as the villain, another raises doubts about that narrative, another introduces survival theories, and none of them can fully prove their case. And here's a shocking fact that really highlights the issue. Historians still disagree, not slightly, but significantly, and what most likely happened to the princes. Even after more than 500 years of study, that's not a small disagreement. That's a fundamental uncertainty about a major historical event. And when experts can't agree, it tells you just how fragile truth can be when it's built on incomplete information. And this is where power comes back into the picture in a big way. Because if you can't control what actually happened, you can still control how it's remembered. Think about that. You don't need to erase the past completely. You just need to guide the narrative in a direction that benefits you. Highlight certain details, ignore others, repeat one version until it becomes the default. And over time, people stop questioning it. Not because it's proven, but because it's familiar. And here's another shocking detail. The negative image of Richard III that many people still hold today was heavily influenced by sources created under the Tudor dynasty's political rivals. That doesn't automatically mean he was innocent, but it does mean his legacy may have been shaped as much by politics as by reality. And once you realize that, you start looking at the entire story differently. But here's the part that really sticks with me, and I think it might stick with you too. This story forces you to sit with uncertainty in a way we're not used to anymore. We live in a time where answers are expected instantly. You search something, you get a result. You ask a question, you expect clarity. But this is the opposite. The more you look into it, the less certain it becomes. And instead of resolving that tension, you have to live with it. And maybe that's why it feels so unsettling, because it reminds us that not everything is knowable, that sometimes the past doesn't give us closure. And here's something to really think about. Even if we had perfect evidence, today DNA, confirmation, documents, everything would it actually change how people feel about the story? Or has the mystery itself become more powerful than the answer? So as we move toward the end of this journey, I want you to hold on to one idea, not about who did it, or what exactly happened, but about what this story teaches us. Because at its core, this isn't just a mystery to solve, it's a reminder that power can shape perception, that silence can be as influential as speech, and that sometimes the stories we inherit are not just records of the past but reflections of the people who chose to tell them. And here's the final question I want you to sit with before the closing chapter. If you had to choose right now based on everything you've heard, what do you believe happened to the princes? And more importantly, why do you believe it? Let's flip this for a second. Imagine this exact story but happening today. 2 children from one of the most powerful families in the country suddenly disappear while under protection. No clear explanation, no confirmed sighting after a certain point, and the person who benefits most from their disappearance ends up taking the highest position in the nation. Be honest. How would that play out? There would be headlines everywhere. Investigations, interviews, leaks, social media exploding with theories within hours, people analyzing every detail, every timeline, every inconsistency. And yet, back then, none of that existed, or at least not in a way that could challenge power effectively. And that's what makes this story hit differently when you look at it through a modern lens, because it forces you to realize just how much information control over that information shapes what people accept as reality. Now here's something really interesting when you compare it to today. Even with all our technology, all our surveillance, all our systems, we still have missing person cases that are never fully solved. That's the part most people don't like to think about, because it breaks the illusion that modern automatically means complete understanding. And here's a shocking fact that puts this into perspective. Even in the 21st century, there are thousands of missing persons cases worldwide that remain unresolved, despite advanced forensic tools and global communication. So when you look back at the disappearance of the princes, with no cameras, no forensic science, no centralized records, it almost becomes less surprising that we don't have a clear answer. In a strange way, it becomes more understandable and more unsettling at the same time. But here's where things get even more uncomfortable, because if this did happen today, the real battle wouldn't just be about finding out what happened, it would be about controlling the narrative. One side presenting evidence, another side questioning it, people choosing what to believe based on trust, bias, or emotion. And suddenly, the story isn't just about facts anymore, it's about perception. And honestly, that's already happening in our world all the time. And here's another shocking detail that connects directly to this. Modern studies show that people often believe information that aligns with their existing views, even when conflicting evidence is presented. So imagine that applied to this case. Some people would be convinced Richard was guilty no matter what. Others would defend him, pointing to lack of proof. And the truth, it might still sit somewhere in between, just as hard to pin down as it was back then. And this brings us back to something we've been circling around this whole time, the idea that truth isn't always as solid as we want it to be, because even with more tools, more access, more voices, the human side of interpretation doesn't change. We still fill gaps. We still create narratives that feel right. We still argue, debate, defend positions. And when you realize that, the story of the princess stops feeling like a distant mystery and starts feeling like a mirror, a reflection of how we handle uncertainty today. And here's something to really think about. If the same event can create completely different truths depending on who's telling it, then how do we ever know when we've reached the real one? So now we're standing at a point where past and present start blending together. A medieval mystery that behaves exactly like a modern one. Conflicting theories, missing evidence, competing narratives, and no final answer that satisfies everyone. Which is why this story doesn't just belong to history, it belongs to anyone who has ever questioned what they're told. And before we move into the final part, I want you to sit with this idea. Maybe the reason this story still feels unresolved isn't just because of what happened back then, but because it reflects something that's still unresolved in how we understand truth today. You know what's strange about this story? Not just that we don't have an answer, but that we keep expecting one. Like somehow, if we just dig a little deeper, read one more theory, analyze one more detail, we'll finally reach that moment where everything clicks into place. The clear ending, the undeniable truth. But what if that moment was never meant to come? What if this story was always going to remain unfinished? Because if you think about it, everything that could have given us closure, witnesses, records, physical proof either never existed, was never preserved, or was quietly lost over time. And that leaves us with something rare, a historical event where the question is stronger than any answer we can give it. Now here's where it gets a little uncomfortable again, because most of us don't like uncertainty. We're wired to resolve things, to categorize them, to decide what's true and what isn't. So when a story like this refuses to settle, we instinctively lean toward the version that feels most believable to us. Maybe you're someone who thinks Richard III had both the motive and the opportunity, it just makes sense. Or maybe you're more skeptical, noticing the lack of direct evidence and the possibility of later narrative manipulation. Or maybe you're drawn to the idea that at least one of the princes survived, because it adds a layer of hope to an otherwise dark story. And here's a shocking fact that explains this behavior. Psychological studies show that when faced with incomplete information, people naturally fill in the gaps with the explanation that feels most coherent to them, not necessarily the one that is most accurate. So in a way, each version of this story says as much about us as it does about history. But maybe that's exactly why it matters, because not every story is meant to give us answers. Some are meant to make us think, to question, to sit with discomfort, and this one does that better than almost any other historical mystery. It forces you to consider multiple possibilities at once, to accept that evidence can be incomplete, that narratives can be influenced, that certainty isn't always achievable. And here's something I want you to really pause on. If we had a definitive answer tomorrow, absolute proof of what happened, would the story lose some of its power? Would it become just another solved case, filed away and forgotten over time? Or is it the lack of closure that keeps it alive, generation after generation? So as we come to the edge of this story, there's no dramatic reveal waiting for you, no final piece of evidence that ties everything together, just a quiet, lingering question that refuses to fade. Two princes enter the tower, and history never clearly tells us how they left. And maybe that's the real ending, not a conclusion, but an absence of one. And before we move into the final closing, I want to leave you with this. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones that give us answers, but the ones that make sure we never stop asking the question. So here we are, at the end of the story, and yet, it probably doesn't feel like an ending at all. No final reveal, no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. Just two boys, a tower, and a silence that somehow managed to survive for more than 500 years. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Not what we know, but what we don't. Because, if you think about it, history has preserved empires, wars, entire civilizations, and yet it couldn't give us a clear answer about what happened to two children. That contrast alone says something. It tells us that sometimes the most important truths aren't the ones that are written down, they're the ones that slip through, disappear, or are quietly left behind. Now let's step back for a second and look at everything we've gone through together. We started with fear to princes inside a tower, hearing footsteps in the night. Then we moved into power, the rise of a man who had everything to gain. Then suspicion, rumors, bones, pretenders, rewritten history, and finally uncertainty. And through all of that, one thing never changed. we never got a definitive answer. And here's a shocking fact that really puts this into perspective. Despite centuries of investigation, debate, and analysis, there is still no universally accepted conclusion about what happened to the princes in the tower. Not most likely, not almost certain, truly unresolved. And in a world where we're used to closure, that kind of mystery feels almost unnatural. But maybe the real story isn't about solving the mystery anymore. Maybe it's about understanding what the mystery represents. Because when you strip everything else away, what you're left with is a story about power unchecked, about voices that were never heard, and about how easily truth can be lost when no one is able or willing to protect it. And here's another shocking detail that stays with a lot of historians. Even at the time, people suspected something had gone wrong, but fear of authority kept most from speaking out. Think about that. The truth might not have been completely hidden, it might have been known, at least in part, but it wasn't safe to acknowledge. And that silence, that's what allowed the mystery to take root and grow into what it is today. And this is where the story becomes personal, in a way, because even though this happened centuries ago, the themes aren't locked in the past. Power, silence, uncertainty, competing narratives, these are things we still see around us. And maybe that's why this story doesn't feel distant. It feels familiar. It reminds us that truth isn't always obvious, that sometimes the loudest version of events isn't the most accurate one, and that asking questions when answers are unclear is more important than ever. And here's something I want you to really reflect on. If you had lived in that time, knowing what you know now, would you have questioned what happened, or would you have stayed silent like most people did? So in the end, we don't walk away with certainty, but we do walk away with something else. Awareness, curiosity, maybe even a bit of discomfort, because this story doesn't wrap itself up neatly. It lingers, it stays with you, it makes you think about how history is shaped, and how easily parts of it can disappear. And maybe that's exactly why it's still being told today, not because we've solved it, but because we haven't. So if you've stayed with me this far, through all the twists and unanswered questions, make sure you stick around, because there are so many more stories like this, quiet, unsettling, and waiting to be uncovered. And who knows, maybe the next one will leave us with answers, or maybe just more questions.